Okay, today's lecture examines the place of mainly white European women in British North America in the 17th and 18th centuries. So from the 1600s, the early 1600s, through the 1700s. I'll start off by looking at ordinary white women and end by considering the lives of extraordinary women. So what do I mean by ordinary? Most what most women's lives were like, which is very much determined by a variety of factors, including class, location, religion, and race, um, of course, being perhaps the most important. So, what do I mean by extraordinary women? They are the women who stepped outside of the boundaries imposed on their lives. For example, lesbians, witches, writers, women held captive by the French and Native Americans, female leaders of the church, and so on. I'll argue that white women's lives were restricted to certain roles: wife, mother, and neighbor. As such, their lives were limited more than men's, and they experienced gender based inequality in most facets of colonial life. But this doesn't mean that women were purely victims of circumstance. Even women leading ordinary lives felt empowered in some respects. And some women, despite many obstacles, found ways to break down some of the boundaries that limited their lives. First, let's set the stage by looking at the broader context for a second. We've already talked some about colonialism in North America. And so the main European countries that colonized the Americas were, of course, the Spanish was perhaps the biggest empire in the Americas, having colonized most of Latin America. There were the French and the Dutch, of course, and also the British. The Dutch occupied present-day New York City for a while in the 17th century before the British took it over. There was also, of course, the Portuguese in South America, most prominently in what became modern-day Brazil. So you also know that violence is always how colonialism gets established, and this violence is always gendered. And the British women who I'm focusing on today, though they were subject to male control and power, were also part of this colonial project. These women, in other words, benefited from the displacement of Native Americans from the land, and through the establishment of towns, farms, and plantations, they helped the British government establish domination in North America, at least in the part of North America that was occupied by the British, mainly the east coast of North America. So this map is a very sort of basic map that shows you the European empires, where the European empires occupied in the Americas. You can see that the British, this area that became, that fought against the British during the American Revolution, was this very small sliver of land along the East Coast. And you could also see here that the Spanish were, of course, the biggest empire. And let's see, the French, this is the French territory in blue. But the French, they occupied this territory, but they didn't settle it with French people for the most part. They just controlled it, and they used it um, for economic interests, for their economic interests. So, for instance, they established the fur trade in this area, which helped to, um, uh, enrich the French Empire. So, what did British North America look like on the ground? So you can see here in this map that the British established 13 separate colonies over the course of the 17th and 18th centuries. On the eve of the American Revolution, there were 13 colonies along that sliver of land on the Atlantic coast, present day, the present day east coast of the United States. There weren't that many people in the British colonies, but over the course of time, the numbers did increase dramatically. So at the start of British colonialism in around 1610, there were about 350 colonists. These were the first colonists who were all in Virginia. Virginia was the first colony to be established by British settlers. But by 1776, on the eve of the American Revolution, there were about 2.5 million people in the British colonies. That's quite a lot, but Britain, which was quite small, is quite small, had 3 times as many people. So most people lived in, of course, small towns and in rural areas and in frontier communities. And by 20th century standards, or 21st century standards, even the largest colonial towns were small, just a few thousand at most. The largest city was Philadelphia with only about 32,000 people. Boston had about 15,000 people as I think that was the second largest city. So if you compare that to today, New York City, the largest city in the US, has 8.4 million people, while Sacramento, which is a relatively small city but pretty big nonetheless, has about 479,000 people. So it's important to emphasize that women's lives in the British colonies were shaped by geography, so where they lived and worked. Though women in the southern colonies, places like Virginia, where the first British colony was established, also had some different experiences than women in New England in the North. Women throughout the British colonies of North America also shared some things in common. Women across the British colonies were subject to English common law, for instance, which treated women unequally. So this concept of femme covert, which I'm about to talk about, is really key. So make sure you take some notes about this. We're going to talk about it in class. By law, well, let's start with the institution of marriage. So by law, wives were obligated to be obedient to their husbands. Married women became what was called femme covert, which means that women's legal identity was totally subsumed by her husband. Married women could not sue or be sued. Married women couldn't write a will or sign a legal contract. They could not hold public office or vote. The husband had legal control over their wives' property, over their wages, if they earned a wage, their children, and even their bodies. Divorce was legal, but only permitted under limited circumstances. Divorce was allowed in cases of adultery, desertion, neglect, and excessive cruelty. Upon divorce, the woman was not actually legally entitled to custody of her own children. And while wife beating was technically illegal, it was tacitly condoned by society. The question that came up in court proceedings did not concern the right of the husband to beat his wife, but rather the appropriateness of the use of violence. In other words, the question might be, did the wife provoke the husband? Adultery was against the law, but wives were punished more harshly than husbands for extramarital affairs. For men, adultery actually was called fornication, not adultery, so there's another word for it. For women, the term was adultery. So a married man having an affair risked only a fine or a whipping, whereas a married woman committing the same crime was risking death. However, adultery was such a heinous crime, especially in New England, that convictions were quite rare. Also, by law, if a husband died, the widow was entitled to only 1/3 of the estate. The male children generally received more when their father died than did the wife. However, widows were entitled to what was called maintenance for life. So they weren't stripped of all of their property, and they had to be able to subsist, to survive, to live after their husband died. Lastly, rape was against the law, but when a married woman was raped, it was considered, quote, not the offense against the woman, but the offense against her husband. Because once married, the woman's sexuality belonged to her husband rather than to herself. So just to repeat that, just to emphasize this, that the rape of a married woman by somebody other than her husband was actually not considered an offense against her, but against her husband because her sexuality belonged to him. Also, marital rape, so rape within marriage, was actually legal and generally not something that was tried in the court of law. Before delving into more detail about the New England region, I want to take a look at what women's lives were like in the Chesapeake region, or the South, particularly the region that is current day Virginia, where the first settlement was, the British settlement was established at Jamestown. So, in contrast to New England, there was a sharp gender imbalance in the South regarding who migrated. The very first settlers at Jamestown in the years following 1607 were all men. So the question is, why were there more men in the South? Or why did more men migrate to the South than to New England? Because the colonists in Virginia intended to find wealth. That was their first priority. They were adventurers, who were more likely to be men, who wanted to emulate the Spanish. They wanted to find gold and silver and other minerals and force Native Americans to labor for them to build their riches. So they were trying to model um, the colony in Virginia after sort of the Spanish model. But subsequent groups of colonists included to this area of the South included unmarried English women meant to become the wives of male settlers. So, because if Jamestown and other British colonies in the South were to become permanent, more women were needed. They had to be sent over to make the men settle down and build towns rather than travel to the Virginia region, try and find gold, and then return to England. The British monarchy had an interest in establishing permanent colonial settlements with British subjects in colonial North America. So that said, women never constituted more than 20% of the entire population in the early years, so in the 1600s. And it was not until the early 1700s that the gender ratio finally evened out in the South. After 1613, when the colonists started raising tobacco in mass quantities for the European market, more laborers were needed. So, despite cultural norms in England that said that women weren't supposed to work as field hands, as agricultural workers, the first women imported to the southern colonies served not only as the sexual partners and wives of the men, but also as another pair of agricultural hands. This is one key difference with New England. Perhaps the biggest difference between the North and the South was that the vast majority of the early white immigrants to the Chesapeake, both male and female, came as indentured servants. So, impoverished young people bound themselves via a legal document to masters for a fixed period of time, sort of like a temporary rather than lifelong slavery, a period of usually between 4 to 6 years. So, women who became indentured servants weren't allowed to marry until their indenture was completed, and thus were subject to sexual exploitation and violence. If these female indentured servants became pregnant, and 20% did, despite the fact that they were not supposed to, they were punished with a public whipping and a fine, and the length of their indentured servitude might also be lengthened. Over the course of the 1600s, though, the enslavement of Africans replaced indentured servitude over time. And no matter what, if you were a white woman in the wealthier class position, you did not, of course, serve as an indentured servant. Rather, you might hire other women to do many of your household chores, or even make enslaved black women do this work. Now, in contrast to the South, in the mid to late 1600s, women and men tended to immigrate as families to New England in relatively equal numbers. So there were a relatively equal number of men and women who migrated to New England, in contrast, sharp contrast to the South. And why was this? Because many of the early immigrants to places like Plymouth and the Massachusetts Bay Colony, two of the earliest British colonies in New England, in present-day Massachusetts, they came in part for religious reasons. About 3/4 of the colonies came as colonists, came as families that included wives and daughters. I mentioned at the start that women's lives were restricted to certain roles: wives, mothers, and neighbors. So what did this mean in the 16th and 17th century? Well, culturally, of course, women were expected to marry and have children. Not terribly different from today. And generally, the young women in New England were between 20 and 22 when they married. So their husbands were about 4 or 5 years older than them. And why was marriage so important? So their religious views, Puritanism, dictated that the family was the linchpin of the social order. Puritans cited the Bible to argue that wives must, quote, revere, fear, and obey their husbands. They cited the story of Adam and Eve in the Bible to justify women's subservience to her husband, which of course says that they cite God's command to Eve, quote, thy desires shall be to thy husband, and he shall rule over thee, unquote. In other words, submission to God and to one's husband were part of the same religious obligation. The subservient relationship of wives to husbands was made clear in the naming practices of the British. So in the 17th century, for instance, the wife was referred to not as Mary Brown or Mrs. Mary Brown, but as John Brown, his wife. So later, of course, Mrs. John Brown would become more common, which also had the effect of subsuming the woman's identity under that of her husband. So this is just a chart that I think provides an interesting comparison to today. As you can see from this graph, though there's still a cultural norm that marriage is a goal, younger people are increasingly either not getting married or getting married much later in life. Whereas in the 1600s, women got married when they were quite young. So also, as we might predict, the Puritans had very specific ideas about when sex was appropriate. Marriage, right? So also was to have sex, you were supposed to be married. Also, heterosexuality, generally speaking, was important. Though ideas about heterosexuality and homosexuality have changed over time, so this is a topic we're going to come back to. In fact, the terms heterosexual and homosexual hadn't been invented at this period of time. But opposite sex marriages and sexuality was the norm, was expected. When people are prudish about sexuality today, they're often referred to as, quote, puritanical. So, but I want to complicate this a little. Though both men and women were clearly subject to puritanical sexual norms, there was also a very clear double standard for men and women. So we've already said that both men and women were expected to be faithful in marriage, but that Puritans punished women more harshly for adultery. The Puritans also viewed men as more naturally sinful than women. So for women, sexual reputation was everything. For men, sexual reputation was only part of a larger pattern of responsibility. So even though men were viewed as more naturally sinful, women were held to a higher sexual standard and risked their entire reputation, risked being called whores, if they violated sexual norms for women. So the Puritan sexual double standard prescribed modesty for women as well. Women generally wore clothing that covered their bodies, but were also expected to cover their heads. And also, men generally controlled women's sexuality. So in cases of adultery and rape, for instance, men were the judges. They were the juries were made up of men, and male ministers were the ones who determined proper sexual behavior. And when a wife had a sexual affair, it was seen as an attack on the husband's property. So did all of this mean that for the Puritans, men and women were supposed to refrain from sex? No, it actually meant that within marriage, sex was perfectly normal and it was healthy. It not only helped to maintain relationships and prevent sin, but led to having more children, which was always good. The way space was organized in New England homes meant that there was very little privacy. The parents' bed often was in a public space, though it might be curtained for privacy, so it had a curtain around it. So the children often slept in the very same room as their parents, and within the family, sex was actually quite public. Many children first became aware of sex from the half-muffled sounds and shapes in the night of their parents, not very far from where they were sleeping, having sex. Before moving on, let's take a look at standards of beauty in the early to mid 18th century. So in an age without photography, we can look to paintings, to portrait paintings commissioned by wealthy families to get a sense of what women look like. I want to take a look at a few paintings that I think shows some of the beauty standards that were prevalent, especially for upper class women, because generally poor women did not have artists paint portraits of themselves. So this is the beauty standard for upper class, beauty standards for upper class women. So this is a portrait of a woman by Robert Feek, one of the most well-known and prolific painters of the period. This is Mrs. Isaac Winslow, another painting by Robert Feek. The Greenwood Lee Family by John Greenwood, another prominent painter. Mrs. Benjamin Austen by John Greenwood. And Mrs. Thomas Gage by John Singleton Copley. This is a little later in 1776, and you can sort of see that the style is changing. So generally you can see, let's go back, right? So you can see that upper class women in New England were tiny-waisted and full-bosomed. Also, this is a little later, right? So this is not, this low-cut dress, I think, indicates that this is somebody who was not in a very religious Puritan household that mandated that she cover herself up. So she's tiny-waisted, she's full-bosomed. There's an emphasis on breasts, as you can see. This was sort of part of a larger impulse to idealize and exaggerate the differences between men and women, as well as sexually objectify women. So women often appeared younger than the men, who might wear white wigs and elaborate waistcoats. And you could obviously see there was, the whiter, the better. You can see that all of these women were painted as very pale, particularly this one. So extremely fair skin among European women was portrayed as beautiful. The reproduction, or having children, was at the center of female life in colonial America. Labor and delivery were central events not only for the mother and baby, but for the community of women in the town. When women gave birth, the husband was essentially very little help. He was not expected to be any help. Rather, female neighbors and a midwife helped with childbirth. So what did these women do? What did the female neighbors and the midwife do? So they provided emotional support, coaching the woman during her labor. They found herbs to ease pain. They cooked and cleaned. They helped to nurse the newborn baby. Women had many babies in the 17th and 18th centuries. First-generation women in Plymouth, Massachusetts had an average of 7.8 children. And it was common for children to die when very young due to illness and undeveloped medical science. And because of this, parents frequently named one child for another who had died. Children who survived were recipients of nurture and affection as infants and toddlers, but as they grew older, this affection was replaced by firm discipline, including hitting, and as well as strict religious rules. And as soon as children could work, they were treated essentially as servants and expected to labor to keep the household going. So having so many children, again, an average of 7.8 children, right, was to some extent financially beneficial to the family, since the children worked as soon as they could to help the family survive. So what did people name their children? A variety of names, including many that sound quite strange to us today. A wide variety of Hebrew names came into common usage beginning in 1560, when the first readily accessible English Bible was published, and many Puritans began to see common names as too worldly and opted instead to name children after virtues or with religious slogans as a way of setting the community, the Puritan community, apart from their non-Puritan neighbors. So some common names were, and these aren't listed, oh yeah, these are listed here, were like Peter, Deborah, John, Nathaniel, Elizabeth, Abigail, Sarah, Richard, Benjamin, James, Judith, William, Alice. Some strange names were names like Appia, Tristram, Thamar, Wyborough, Sobriety, Forsaken, Lament, Abstinence, Vanity, Verity, Felicity, Chastity, Delilah, and Eden. Quite different from how, for the most part, I mean, how different from how people name their children today. So today, doctors, the vast majority of them male until not long ago, take primary responsibility for childbirth, but in the 16th and 17th centuries, women serving as midwives delivered the babies. But the rapid development of forceps in the second half of the 18th century gave, so from 1750 to the end of the century to 1800, gave the male physician a technological advantage he had not had before. By 1800, male science, or medicine, had diverged dramatically from female tradition, and midwifery was under attack. Okay, before moving on to extraordinary women, I want to take some time to look at the kinds of labor women performed in the 17th and 18th centuries. So let's look for a second at the context for how women's labor. This is prior to the rise of industrial capitalism in the late 1800s. And that means that the economy was largely rural and there weren't large cities like there are today. Families produced a lot more for their own consumption, though they weren't completely isolated or self-sufficient. They relied on neighbors for assistance and bartering when necessary. And the existence of networks of trade, often referred to as merchant capitalism, in contrast to industrial capitalism, also meant that people purchased certain commodities not grown at home or in town. Sugar grown and cultivated by enslaved people in the Caribbean, for instance, being the most prominent. European immigrants tried to transplant the gendered division of labor that existed in Europe to the English colonies in North America. So what do I mean when I say the, quote, gendered division of labor? It just means that how labor was divided, the kinds of labor that men performed generally, and the kinds of labor that women performed. And of course, we still have a gendered division of labor today. It's not just about women being more responsible for housework and caring for the children, but also we see that there are more women who are nurses, more women who are flight attendants, so that's changing increasingly. We see more women who are elementary school teachers, etc., and more men working in construction, more men as engineers. So the gendered division of labor is still very much alive today, though of course it looked different. The kinds of labor women and men did in this earlier period of time, in the 1600s and 1700s, was different. Many white women were much more likely to engage in labor close to home, so doing housework. And women in New England and the middle colonies, so present-day New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and later in Virginia, also worked hard from sunup to sundown. Household labor didn't only involve caring for the children and the elderly, cooking food and cleaning, though of course all of this labor was very difficult because it was prior to modern technology. So a wife what would a day look like in the of a wife in New England, of a British wife in New England? She might wake up and start the fires for cooking in the morning, which she would use throughout the day. She'd milk the cows early in the morning, make butter. She would spend much of her day preparing food, baking bread for her family, and the family would eat that bread at noonday dinner and evening supper. She would brew the beer that went with almost every meal. Beer went with almost every meal because it was safer to drink often than the unsanitary water. So she would garden in the afternoon. She would wash and mend clothes. She would take grain to the millers. And there were also various seasonal tasks. So she made preserves in the fall, jam, and that sort of thing. And there were the seemingly endless duties connected with cloth production in the winter. So there's not garment factories at this point in time. So a lot of the labor that went into making clothing was done by women. There were also, of course, many women who, often in desperate circumstances, found themselves working as prostitutes or sex workers. And, a woman whose husband is dead and she has no family to depend on, she might have to resort to prostitution. It was also a common practice for young women who weren't yet married to work as servants in other people's homes. So for the few years prior to getting married, a young white British woman would work as a servant in a woman's home. If you were a white woman in a well-off economic position, you might hire other women to do many of your household chores throughout your adult life, or of course force enslaved black women to do this work. And we're going to come back to slavery a little later, but even in the North, especially into the 1700s, late 1600s and 1700s, before the American Revolution, families in the North also owned people. They enslaved black women and men. So in childhood, few girls of any social class received any formal education. They were taught by their parents in the 1600s, if they were taught at all. So in Puritan New England, girls were taught to read the Bible only, but writing was reserved for boys. So girls were not taught how to write. And for 2 centuries, most women did not learn how to write at all. And it wasn't until the late 19th century, the late 1800s, that more girls would actually learn how to write with advancements in female education for girls and women. Girls, not even from elite backgrounds in early U.S. history, attended college. Only boys were allowed to. And of course, formal schooling for African Americans who were enslaved, who were slaves, was virtually non-existent. And education for Native Americans where it existed, concentrated on quote unquote civilizing them or stripping them of their traditional customs. So let's turn to what the situation was like for women who didn't lead ordinary lives, so extraordinary women. The words lesbian, gay, and homosexual did not exist then, but there were people, including women, whose emotional and sexual attachments were toward women rather than men. Little has been written about this history in the 1600s and 1700s, but one historian, Rachel Hope Cleaves, has researched and written about 2 extraordinary white women who lived their lives with one another in the first years of the 19th century, right after the Revolution, the years following the Revolution. They were Charity Bryant and Sylvia Drake. They were highly unusual. Sexual relationships between people of the same gender were both legally and socially proscribed or looked down upon in both the British colonies and in early America after the Revolution. Though, of course, sexual relationships between people of the same gender always happened, even if they were legally and socially prescribed. So that we have to recognize that. It was also incredibly difficult for women to live their lives with each other, i.e. without men, because of the limited economic opportunities for women and the discriminatory laws regarding property ownership that we've discussed. So prior to the American Revolution, the waged labor white women could get was quite limited. So they could work as prostitutes, they could work as servants, midwives, and innkeepers primarily. After the American Revolution, so the years after 1783, teaching opened up as a profession as well, and Charity Bryant was able to, at first, scrape by on the very poor wages paid to her as a school teacher. Then Sylvia and Charity established a sewing business, but had to work constantly just to survive because of the low wages. The historian Rachel Hope Cleaves writes, "For more than 40 years, Sylvia and Charity worked without rest, sacrificing sleep and health. The women labored 18-hour days, sewing clothes for men, women, and children. For most women, the price of independence was just too high to pay if a heterosexual marriage was an alternative. So many women who might have essentially been lesbians felt that they had to get married to men for purely economic reasons." Here's the gravestone for Charity and Sylvia. So you can visit it. I think it's in Vermont. There were other extraordinary women, like Anne Hutchinson. She arrived in Massachusetts from Britain in 1634 with her husband and began proselytizing or preaching among women only. And she got into trouble for violating gender norms. Preaching was for men only. And she got into trouble for criticizing some of the teachings of Puritan male preachers. She was ultimately tried for violating gender norms in the Puritan community, and she was excommunicated. So she moved to Rhode Island from Massachusetts because it was relatively more religiously tolerant than Massachusetts was. If you're interested, here's a book, American Jezebel by Eve LaPlante. There's a number of books about Anne Hutchinson because she was so unusual in early American history. So female authors were also quite extraordinary. Very few women were writers. Only 4 women, for example, were represented in the 911 books produced in 17th century New England. And of these, there was the famous poet Anne Bradstreet. Also, Mary Rowlandson wrote A True History of the Captivity and the Restoration of Miss Mary Rowlandson, which was widely read in the 1700s. In the 17th and 18th centuries, tensions between whites and local Native American tribes and conflict between the French and the British erupted in what historians have called, quote, a great struggle for empire. And in the course of the war, people, including many women, were taken captive, either as spoils of war or bargaining chips. So Mary Rowlandson was one of the most famous captives. She was taken captive for 11 weeks by Native Americans during King Philip's War of 1675 to 1676. And she wrote a narrative about her experience, right? And it was quite racist. It describes Native Americans as heathens and barbarous creatures. But she also indicates that she was never raped or beaten during her captivity, which arguably would not have been the case for a Native American woman taken captive by the British. Interestingly, female captives were much more likely to stay with Native American tribes than were male captives. Men resisted, and women were much more likely to adapt to Native American cultural traditions. And some historians have tried to explain this by saying that the freedom for women in Native American tribes was stronger than it was for women who lived in British colonial towns and communities. Okay, so we've come to the end, and I want to just reiterate the argument I started this lecture with. So white women's lives were restricted to certain roles, wife, mother, and neighbor. And as such, their lives were limited more than men's, and they experienced, of course, gender-based inequality in most facets of colonial life. But this doesn't mean that women were purely victims of circumstance. Even women leading ordinary lives felt empowered in some respects. And some women, despite many, many obstacles, found ways to break down some of the boundaries that limited their lives.